We will move to the first debate of the evening, which the whips have agreed will be on paragraph 4 of Executive Report number 3, dealing with the review of the Housing Department. I now call on the Leader of the Council to move reception of that report and Councillor Senior to move paragraph 4. Set out on page 19 of the supplementary agenda. Councillor Osborne.
If you would like me to, yes, I'll move it formally.
Okay, and Councillor?
Formally.
Thank you. Right, so Councillor Osborne, and so now we come to the speakers. So, Councillor Thomas.
Madam Mayor, fellow councillors, I'd like to start by placing this debate in some context. Wandsworth is in the grip of a growing housing crisis. House prices up 10% in the past year, and private rents by even more, by 14%. The average income of those purchasing under shared ownership for three-bedroom property is now nearly £50,000. We're seeing the disastrous effects of the unjust and crude welfare cuts, with lives turned upside down and those on low incomes pushed out of the borough. Virtually every week now I'm contacted by people, many of them actually people in decent jobs, who are truly desperate because they've been evicted by their landlords and they're unable to find anywhere else where they can afford to rent. All in all, nearly 3,000 private renters in Wandsworth have been affected by the government's housing benefit cuts. More than 2,000 tenants by the bedroom tax, and around 850 residents by the overall benefits cap. Unsurprisingly, the result has been a rise in the levels of homelessness, with families now being rehoused by the council as far away as Portsmouth and Reigate, by the council's own admission. In the face of such challenges, surely what we need is a positive vision of how to develop Wandsworth's housing function, one based on the principles of preventing homelessness, prevention not cure, and increasing the quality and affordability of the housing available. Instead, what we have in this paper is a set of proposals totally lacking in imagination, clarity of purpose, or indeed common sense. Under the Council's plans, the very area of the Housing Department that is most critical to dealing with the impact of the housing crisis will be amongst the hardest hit, with a reduction in the number of staff from 28 to 18 as a result of the merging of the homelessness and allocation functions. What will this mean in practice? Well, the answer is more people falling through the gaps of an overloaded service and waiting for longer. Already, last year, the Council missed its target for the assessment of homelessness applications within 33 working days, and that can only get worse on these proposals. The staff themselves summarised the situation very well in their submission to the Finance and Corporate Resources OSC. They said, given that the number of homelessness applications per officer is expected to exponentially increase, the proposal to reduce the size of the team responsible for assessing homelessness is illogical and totally non-strategic. Indeed, if, as seems very likely, the result is that people have to stay in temporary accommodation for longer while they wait for a decision, this could end up being totally self-defeating by actually leading to greater, not less, expenditure. Furthermore, as a result of the policy of flexible tenancies, in future staff will be expected to review tenants' circumstances every 5 years to determine whether they should still get social housing. Yet there is no assessment in the paper of the additional workload that this would entail, or how the new arrangements would cope with it. Nor is there any assessment of how deleting 2 posts dedicated to private sector enforcement will impact on the Council's ability to protect tenants from rogue landlord activity, something that's becoming ever more important as competition for private tenancies increases. Madam Mayor, we are in the middle of a programme of housing changes that are leading to massive social change and which will have a major impact on the future face of our borough. Many people are experiencing real hardship at the very same time as the rights that they had previously are being watered down. At such a time as this, it is more important than ever that the Council is there to provide our residents with the help they need by working with them to find solutions to their housing problems and stepping in where needed to provide a safety net. We need to know that the Housing Department will have the capacity to take the right decisions to protect the vulnerable and the least well-off, and to ensure that we retain the diversity of people that makes Wandsworth what it is today. The changes we're being asked to approve today will fatally weaken our ability to achieve this. They're a knee-jerk reaction that will hit hardest those who are already victims of this government's and this administration's failed housing policies. Our residents deserve better. I urge you to support the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Could I just share with councillors that the whips actually agreed that Councillor Osborne would have 10 minutes and Councillor Ellis would have 10 minutes. So, Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I will try not to take up 10 minutes. I thought I would make my contribution really rather more factual, because clearly there are other speakers, and really to try and put the whole thing into context. What we are proposing in this paper is the deletion of 74 posts and the creation of 30 posts, resulting in a net deletion of 44. It's not exactly those figures because some of those posts are part-time. Roughly half the posts that we're proposing to delete are funded either entirely, or majority of the salaries are funded by the general fund. And so this is actually driven, of course, by the need to find savings, and in fact the figure of over £250,000, which is a very considerable saving to the general fund, is actually contained there in question 1. The remainder of the posts that are proposed to be deleted are funded entirely by the housing revenue account, and they include 2 senior officers. I know the opposition are terribly keen that senior officers' pay is deleted, and we are in fact axing 2 senior officer posts, and a number of back office posts. There's been no mention, interestingly, made of those people at all. So in total, of the 44 posts for deletion, at the moment 21 are currently vacant. 2 of the staff are actually redeployed elsewhere, and the private sector housing team is actually moving to the new public health division. So the actual numbers of possible redundancies are nowhere near as great as perhaps you may have been led to believe. Obviously, we will do all we can to avoid redundancies wherever possible, because we recognise that this is not a position that any member of staff would like to be faced with. However, savings do need to be made in the general fund. As we know, the mess that the country's in was absolutely nothing to do with the outgoing government. We've absolutely no idea how on earth the country got in the mess that it did, but there you are, these things happen. Indeed. Now, the other thing that's sort of doing the rounds at the moment is this sort of notion that this really ought to have been dealt with at the Housing Overview and Scrutiny Committee, because this is housing revenue money and it's nothing to do with the council taxpayer. I suppose the implication being it doesn't really matter, you can spend as much as you like. I'm afraid we don't actually agree with that, and there are a number of reasons actually why it didn't come to the last Housing Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Nothing to do with deception, which I think is a word that's been bandied around as well, I think rather irresponsibly. There are 2 reasons. First of all, staffing matters have always gone to the Finance and Corporate Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee, and although I'm not actually on that committee, I did take a look at the agenda for that particular evening and noticed that staffing matters for another department were being discussed. I'm not aware of any reference at motion in respect of them, so perhaps there may be some particular reason for this one. The other reason that...
Will the member take an interruption?
Not at the moment, Councillor Belton, because you'll be speaking later, so I'm sure...
Just a matter of fact.
Okay.
Just a matter of fact, I'm intrigued to know who might have been accusing the council of deception, because I hadn't heard that myself. I just suspect that's a little bit of gloss that Councillor Ellis is putting in. But I'd be interested if he can quote.
I certainly can, because we actually, I think we all received a link to one of Labour Councillor's blogs. They very kindly sent it to all of us, and I think the word is, and I'm possibly paraphrasing, and I apologise if I haven't got the wording exactly correct, but I think it was the Housing Overview and Scrutiny Committee was deceived. Maybe you haven't read that blog, I don't know. I don't blame you if you haven't. The other reason that the staffing changes could not have been considered at our meeting in mid-September is that in order to start the consultation and informing the staff and the consultation, we do have to give a month's notice of that, which would have meant, of course, that this would have to have been done in August, probably not the best of times because a lot of people would be on holiday at the time. So really the special meeting of the Finance and Corporate Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee was in fact the first occasion that this could have been done, and indeed all the staff were affected, were informed on exactly the same time on the same day. So, in summary, Madam Mayor, this regrettable measure will result in considerable savings to the general fund at a time when we certainly do need the savings. There is obviously a commensurate savings to the housing revenue account. There are pressures on the HRA, so that money may be useful. If we don't require it for that, it can be used for greater investment and spending on our estates, something I would have thought that most of our residents would regard as a frontline service and something of which they would approve. Or if we choose not to spend it on that, then it can go toward reducing people's charges. Again, something I think that our residents will appreciate also. I think that's, Madam Mayor, I think that's about all I can say on that. There are other speakers, and no doubt some of the debate will become a little bit more emotive, but I did feel it was perhaps important that we had the facts rather than the invective.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hogg.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think housing is the biggest issue that faces this council, and obviously it's an issue that affects every one of us, whether young renters going through a series of expensive short-term flats, parents struggling to help their children find a way, acting as the bank of mom and dad, and of course homeless families who find their lives in pieces. Local house prices are now 13 times local salaries. Wandsworth is living through a housing crisis, and as Councillor Thomas I thought very skillfully outlined, there's a series of welfare reforms going through that are hitting our poorest residents, and that impact is only going to amplify over the coming year. So housing is important, and that's why I think Wandsworth's housing department is important. It does fantastic work. We've got extraordinary tenant satisfaction levels. Officers have created hundreds of hidden homes. Graffiti removal is incredibly effective. Hugely popular open days to encourage home ownership, affordable housing. And there's a big picture too. The wonderful up to 100 million regeneration of some of our most deprived estates is made possible because of the prudent management of our housing revenue account, which has a projected £1.8 billion surplus. And it can't be said often enough in this debate, housing is funded by people who live in council housing. There is a legal ring fence around the money collected in rent. There's more than £100 million each year. So unlike other cuts debates, this isn't about money we get from the government. This isn't about money we're taking from council taxpayers. Now, the first thing to say about these proposals is that they were rushed through to evade scrutiny. The plans, we now know, were fully formed at the time of the last housing OSC, but were hidden from councillors. This is not fair dealing. And councillors from both parties were treated equally, with contempt. One member of the Housing Committee was unaware of the plans until I told her this week. Residents' representatives have not been consulted, and staff say consultation has not properly taken place. That's why Councillor Belton and I called a public meeting yesterday, and why we've requisitioned a special housing OSC for November the 4th. Although it is increasingly difficult to see the point of Housing Committee if our decisions can be overturned by later deals with developers, backroom discussion with lobbyists, and now small groups of people behind closed doors deciding on the staffing of the department with no reference to us whatsoever. But the process, which stinks, is not really the main problem here. These cuts are not necessary, they're not good value for money, and they have no strategic basis. Worst of all, they'll damage the services used by our most vulnerable residents. Staff who deal every day with the rising tide of homelessness cut, our frontline bedroom tax specialists gone, housing trainees scrapped. To slice £370,000 from the hard-pressed general fund, the proposal is to hack £1.5 million from the perfectly healthy rents account. Now, we all back budget reductions that don't harm services. That's sensible. That's what most of us do in our jobs all the time. There's nothing useful about inefficiency. But this is mad. Imagine an independent housing association that had the financial muscle of Wandsworth. It would be planning to reach out to support vulnerable residents and maybe putting in place a development programme, not issuing redundancy slips in time for Christmas. These dangerous cuts have tried to avoid scrutiny, but people will be watching. The staff and their families will be watching to see if their jobs are being used to pay for the traditional pre-election rent cuts. Employment specialists will be watching to see if the jobs consultation is done fairly. And accountants and lawyers will be watching, as some councils seem to think the end game here, the answer to their problems is a massive transfer of tenants' rent money to fund other activities. The Housing Department exists to provide housing services. It's not a piggy bank for the council. The Housing Department's finances are sound, its services are crucial, and its staff are widely respected. These plans are wrong, they're harmful, and they're costly, and they should be rejected.
Thank you. Councillor Hogg. Councillor Nichols.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This paper deals with the savings needed to allow the Council to continue spending in priority areas such as ensuring that our housing continues to meet acceptable standards, regenerating Winstanley York Road estates and Roehampton, and also maintaining our investment in delivering additional affordable housing. There is common ground between the parties that more affordable homes must be built to accommodate households affected by the regeneration plans, the broader plans emerging from, the options appraisal. Therefore, with the almost complete absence of a social housing grant, the Council must look to its own resources to fund new homes and other initiatives. Ultimately, I believe the loss of posts in the housing services element of the housing revenue account and the housing services subdivision of the general fund are the opposition's major concerns, as I believe that they believe the frontline services will diminish substantially. I don't believe that this will happen. The Housing Department intends to prioritise its activities and change the processes to reduce the time expectations of its clients and deliver cost-saving efficiencies, both of which are achievable. A fundamental review of the Housing Services Division, the frontline service that deals with homelessness prevention and rehousing, will mean a move away from structures that reflect the Council's statutory functions to one that adopts a approach. Staff will be arranged in groups around common functions which will generate significant efficiencies. For example, it is ultimately sensible for one team to deal with all properties owned by private landlords, irrespective of whose properties are to be allocated to. In future, one group of officers will liaise with and build up relationships with private landlords, unlike now, where different teams across the division may find themselves approaching the same landlord. It's clear to me that efficiencies made by addressing how services are delivered, resulting in no reduction in frontline services, is the best way to tackle the financial challenges that the Council is currently facing. Housing services activity is by far the main area of general fund spend in the Housing Department, and so the reasons behind the review should be obvious to all. I'm confident that a high-performing department such as the Housing Department, which in the opposition's own words has officers that are widely respected, can successfully pull this kind of review off, one which seeks to tease efficiencies out of processes while protecting frontline services. There are savings that fall to the housing revenue account that are linked to the review of the homelessness prevention work areas. As the two are intrinsically linked, can't afford one without the other. However, over half of the total savings generated by this paper are through efficiency across a range of support functions, mostly funded through the HRA. Therefore, it is only right that, like the General Fund, costs charged to the HRA are similarly challenged to squeeze out efficiencies to ensure that council tenants continue to receive value for money. The housing department...
Councillor, we've got this
Okay.
on red.
Thank you very much.
Round it up. Oh, okay. Right, Councillor Bilton.
I can't be the only person slightly bored with the bromides that come out of council meetings. If we have to hear any more about the 2008 economic disaster, which, by the way, happened in Washington, Frankfurt, Paris, and every other capital in the country, in the world, as well as London, without a reference on the other side to the fact it was a world crisis, then they're just blinding themselves.
Will
no
the,
one believes
will-
this
will
nonsense.
the
What is
councillor
more?
stand
No, I'm
down?
not giving way on this occasion,
Give way.
Councillor. What is more on this occasion, 5 years later, and after 3 years of Tory government, we're still not back to the level of production of 2008, and that's with a population and a workforce much higher. So what the standard productivity one did, but bromides. We're now getting bromides on housing, and my goodness me, I've listened to this long enough. We are providing plenty of affordable housing, council house sales were in effect the result, etc., etc., etc. It is now commonplace in the local hostelries, talk to any senior...
Will the councillor now step aside?
Is it a matter of fact or opinion?
I'm entitled to challenge at any time. You can decide whether you stand down.
Thank you, Councillor.
I think it's important that we try and clarify what the opposition from this side of the House is to the Labour Party's policies. The fact was, at the height of the boom, you were running a 3% budget deficit when you should have been running a 3% surplus. You then ran a 9% deficit as a result of the crash that you helped to create, and the result is putting the country to near bankruptcy. That is the thing that you still near to decide.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bilton.
You wouldn't believe that he supports the same excellent football team as I do, would you? I mean, exactly what I said before bromides. Now it is common parlance amongst all senior officers and all members of the council go to any hostelry and start talking about housing, and they almost universally say, I couldn't possibly buy the house I live in now on my salary today. And half the senior officers I'm talking to have got six-figure salaries and they couldn't afford to live in Wandsworth. There's nothing unique about this. Everyone in the borough, indeed the country, knows it, and yet you're kind of in denial. Now, so I was delighted when I thought the bromides had stopped a couple of weeks ago, and I got hold of the South London Press. And there's the South London Press, nice picture of Councillor Senior and Mr. Eric Pickles on the front, and I quote fairly accurate, I just choose words here, Councillor Senior blasted Community Secretary Eric Pickle, who along with other ministers were, he was afraid, that's Councillor Senior, in denial about the impact of his cuts on local authority services. So when it gets to speaking the truth and lobbying ministers, Councillor Senior says they are in denial. Now, I I was amazed, therefore, that the next day, as you know, many of you know, I wasn't exactly fit at the time, so the next day, I think it might have been a day earlier, I looked at the agenda, and the Housing Committee is hammered by £2 million cuts. £2 million cuts, of which 74%, I worked it out, affected the housing revenue account. Now, a housing revenue account, I don't know whether you're aware, but this is the graph from the paper, is forecast in 30 years, let's admit it's 30 years, but in 30 years to be in reserves of £2 billion. Now, of course, £1 million here or two affects that over 30 years quite substantially, but we are talking about the richest, best funded, most affluent housing revenue account in the city and probably in the country. And yet we are making cuts in the services that supplies. Now if that was just a matter of funding, then perhaps what Councillor Tracy's heckling would have a point. But there is a housing crisis out there, and there are people being hit. I've got an example from this week. I have an example from this week of a tenant in the borough who was made redundant because of local authority cuts last July, got into arrears with her rent as a consequence, single person, one bedroom flat. And she wanted to carry on working in the public sector, so she got a job after a time, 13k a year, not exactly massive, 13k a year in Wandsworth Prison. By which time she had arrears, and as you work out, 13k a year is about £250 a week. And so she got £100 a week rent, and she has to agree to pay off £25 of her arrears as well each week, leaving her a massive amount of £125. There are lots of people in this chamber, and I know it for a fact because I've been with them in their times, who don't think a second about spending £125 having dinner for themselves and their spouse, perhaps, on one occasion. And this woman's got it for a whole week. There is a housing crisis there, Councillor Tracy, and for you to bat on about how healthy the revenue account is as a good thing, it's a great thing if you used it to ameliorate the problems that are out there. If all you're doing is stacking it in the bank, then it's the most dire financial mismanagement that you could possibly imagine. I support the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor.
Mr. Mayor, I do not happily support any path that will lead to redundancies. In the case of the Housing Department, sadly, however, I can see no option. I listened with interest to the staff side comments put clearly and succinctly to committee last week. I would love to have helped, but quite simply, in the harsh world of reality, I did not see how. In July of this year, the government issued a consultation on its local government grant settlement for the next 2 years. This included a top slicing of the funding to finance a range of new initiatives and to provide additional resources for those councils affected by business rate safety net. The net overall impact is to reduce mainstream support from central government to Wandsworth by 23% over the next 2 years, a loss of £43 million. In addition to that, inflation over the period is estimated to add a further £17 million pressure to general fund budgets. In order to maintain a balanced budget as required by statute, the Council will therefore need to cut its costs, increase its income, or use balances or reserves to meet that shortfall. Based on the latest revised general fund framework, if no action is taken to address this funding gap, in 2 years' time, the Council's share of council tax would need to double. Ignoring the GLA precept, this would mean an increase from £388.54 this year to £578.34 in 2014-15 to £799.80 in 2015-16, an increase of 106%. However, a local referendum would be required for any council tax increase over the government's increased thresholds, which are currently set at 2%, but which may be lowered. The cost of holding a referendum itself is estimated in the region of £380,000. To counter this, the Council has entered into a series of measures for which inevitably the Housing Department has not been immune. Indeed, in paper 13631, the Director delivered ongoing General Fund savings of £377,000 as a contribution towards plugging this gap. While the focus has inevitably been on the General Fund position, the housing revenue account is not immune from such pressures. It's only right that we continue to drive out inefficiencies in our HRA spending in a way that delivers value for money, which is exactly what the Housing Department review seeks to do. I accept on the face of it our reserves are high, with combined revenue and capital reserves standing at 210 million, projected to rise to 1.9 billion. However, this figure is built on a raft of assumptions that could, if varied, have a significant negative impact. They include assumptions about future inflation, rates, rent increases, and major works, any or all of which could change significantly over the next 30 years. We should therefore continue to make prudent and well-informed decisions in relation to our housing stock, and now is not the time to be committing to spend future resources that may or may not materialise. It's on the current position that we need to be focusing. Reserves are running at a sustainable level in the short to medium term, with the Council able to repay its self-financing debt, continue to maintain its stock to decent home standard, and continue to manage its housing stock to high levels of resident satisfaction. The Council is also planning to invest, in addition, affordable housing and to spend significant amounts of money regenerating the Winstanley York Road estates and the Roehampton estates. Balanced against these aspirations are some very real financial pressures on the horizon in the form of welfare reforms and national rent-setting policy, all of which will have a negative impact both on the General Fund and the HRA. We must therefore be realistic. However, we would love to be otherwise. I therefore commend this most painful but most necessary paper to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Osborne.
Okay, I think by now the Conservative majority in this council has got the measure of my style. When I deal with this council, I am quick to criticise what this administration does, as I've said before, and my duty is to oppose what you do. The clue is in my title, Leader of the Opposition. It's my role in this council. But I'm quick to praise too when this council gets something right. And I apply 3 tests to proposals coming from the majority party. Is it in the interests of the people of Wandsworth? Is it common sense? And is it honest? And this proposal actually falls short on all 3 of those. And I'll say why I think that. First of all, and Councillor MacDonald and Councillor Ellis have danced around this point, but they have not put it in its rightful, crude reality to this council. 1.5 million is being cut from a robustly healthy housing revenue account so that you have an overall package which includes about £350,000, £370,000 worth of cuts to the General Fund. And that fact is not coming out as bluntly as it should be. What's happening is it's being cloaked. We're being told, oh, the housing revenue account's not really that healthy at all. We're making all kinds of assumptions about it, and the assumptions might change. Well, some of the assumptions we are making are absurdly cautious. For example, we're looking at the housing revenue account saying, well, it might be under threat because of bad debt in the coming years, in the face of this housing crisis which we've got at the moment. And we're giving a quantification to the likely level of bad debt, 7%. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever to back up a figure that high for bad debt in this authority. The only thing I'd say, I'd put it at rather half that figure. And that's just one example of an area where we're saying there's a problem with the housing revenue account. Actually, what's going on is we are casting doubt over the housing revenue account in order to make it possible to dig into that and get the overall package. That caution would be better placed elsewhere. That caution would be better placed in matters like the areas where the cuts are actually taking place. Cuts to the frontline service, cuts to the frontline staff are going too far and too fast. At this pace, you are stacking up problems for the future, costs for the future. I wonder how straight the leadership of the Conservative administration has been with its backbenchers about what's going on in the Housing Directorate. I wonder how much evidence has been laid out in front of Conservative councillors as to how close... How close... I'm not giving way, no. This is a serious matter, and I'm in...
Well, it is a serious matter. You have suggested that the members on the backbench members on this side have not been led properly.
Let me put the point.
Could the leader ask a question?
Let me put the point. I wonder how close they realise they are coming to falling short of the standard and required levels of delivery of service in the Housing Directorate, and the level of scrutiny which the Department of Communities and Local Government is taking in Wandsworth Council as a result. But anyway, if we are not careful, those cuts are going to make those matters much, much worse, and are going to stack up costs in the future. I think the point here is this. Who's going to carry the can if this all goes badly wrong? Now, strictly speaking, you'd have thought it would be the cabinet member in charge of housing. But actually, he didn't have much say in what happened on this. The decision went to Finance and Corporate Resources. And that's where the decision was taken on this matter. The Housing Committee, which draws in council tenants and leaseholders into its decision-making, wasn't given an opportunity to look at this cut to the housing revenue account. Not the general fund, but the housing revenue account. It was bounced, and the decision went to the Finance and Corporate Resources Committee instead. Utter contempt for good practice, contempt for the members of that committee, all of them, including those that attend from outside this council, and contempt for the people of Wandsworth. That's why we are proposing this matter goes back to the Housing Committee. That's what our amendment says. I urge you all to vote for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne. Councillor Senior. Councillor, could you put your...
These sorts of things need to be properly considered and to be properly thought about. And that's why we have had to look at the staffing in this particular area. Let's remember the point hasn't been made so far that this area hasn't had a serious service review in 12 years. So I think it is appropriate to look at it again. To say that it is somehow being done in a contemptible way is completely wrong, because one of the reasons it went to the Finance and Corporate Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee was to allow time for a consultation with staff, something I would have thought the Labour Party would normally be in agreement with. These proposals have been carefully examined. I think, although as Councillor MacDonald said, we regret doing them, they are necessary, and that we should still be able to provide an appropriate level of service after they have been implemented.
Thank you, Councillor Senior. That concludes the debate. Now, the motion now before the Council is the amendment proposed at this meeting by Councillor Osborne and seconded by Councillor Carpenter. Concerning, can I just complete it? Concerning the review of staffing in the Housing Department as set out in paragraph 4 of report number 3. So you don't wish to have a show of hands, you want a division. It is granted. Division has been called, 5 members. So any members not wishing to vote should now retire from the hall unless he or she wishes to remain in the hall and have their name recorded as abstaining. Councillor Thomas. Again, against, 4, 12, 36 against, abstention 0.
The amendment's lost.
And the amendment is lost. So the paragraph 4, can the paragraph 4 now be received as information? Or would you like to put your hands up or,
Same numbers.
or the same numbers? Okay. Thank you.